Well, hi, everybody. This is Doug Reeves broadcasting from Boston tonight, where the American League Championship Series is tied, at least for now. I hope everybody else is having a great time this evening, wherever in the world this finds you. I know we have people joining us from all time zones in the United States, as well as some hardy souls in Europe and the Middle East. So thank you for taking time to take a few minutes to learn how leaders can make a difference right now. As the title suggests, our emphasis is on a sense of urgency. This is not a Stalinist 5-year plan. These are the sort of things that you can do literally this semester before winter break to make a difference for student achievement. And I will make sure that we're not in the ivory tower, but rather give you information that you can use immediately. The handouts for tonight's presentation are all available, as with all of our resources at Creative Leadership Solutions. They are free. The webinar recording will be available as a free download. We have a number of videos as well as research articles and tools at creativeleadership.net, also available for free. And finally, I've placed, as you can see, my personal contact information. I tweet at Douglas Reeves. My text, the international number is there that will reach me from anywhere in the world. And I blog at creativeleadership.net. So whatever your preferred method of communication is, please feel free to get in touch. I literally 10 minutes ago was on the phone with somebody from Taiwan who was astonished that I actually answer my emails and my phone calls, and I really do. So wherever in the world you happen to be, please don't think it's an imposition. It's a two-way street. Hopefully you can learn some things from me, and I know that I learned some things from you if you're willing to tell me about the successes and the challenges that you're having in your schools, wherever they may be. So let's get underway. First of all, just a couple of recent things. I wrote an article some of you may have seen in Ed Leadership a couple of months ago called Restoring the Teacher Pipeline. And friends, this is serious. Nationwide, the pipeline is down 35%. By pipeline, I mean the difference between what colleges of education are producing and what school systems need. In bellwether states like Michigan and California, it's down 50%. In Oklahoma, a single school district is able to absorb every single teacher preparation candidate that the state is providing. And what that is going to lead to is a train wreck of uncredentialed, unqualified, unprepared teachers. And to be clear, look, these are good people. So those of you who are not credentialed or on emergency credential, please don't think I'm insulting you. I'm just saying there's a difference between walking into a classroom prepared and walking into a classroom without having any previous experience. And we as your colleagues owe it to you to try to restore this teacher pipeline. That's what the article is about. And for the policymakers listening, let me tell you, money is important. You can't have 6-figure debt and a 5-figure income. But as you'll see in the article, money is only number 7. There's other issues like respect and autonomy that we have to build in to keep people in our profession and have them willing to enter the profession. And I'm concerned about this as a serious issue. Many of you have already told me that you're having trouble recruiting, and we have to address it. So that's an article you might want to consider sharing with your friends, maybe your legislators as well. Teacher evaluation, a wonderful article written by my friend Kim Marshall. And I will tell you, one of the things that's driving people out is toxic evaluation programs. We've had a 20-year experiment with 40-page evaluation forms that are unwieldy, time-consuming wastes, and unrelated to student achievement. There is a better way, and that article suggests that you might find a better way, which, by the way, is free at marshallmemo.com. You don't even have to subscribe for the grand sum of $50 to the Marshall Memo to be able to get what I think are the best teacher observation instruments out there. It'll save you money, save you time, and worthwhile considering. For leaders, I've created the Leadership Performance Matrix based on a 37-state study. That also is a free download. It not only, I think, helps your most senior people be challenged to go beyond their present level of excellence, but it will help develop new people. And speaking frankly, if people look at that matrix and say, man, if this is what leadership is about, I don't want any part of it, then great. Don't enter administration and educational leadership for all the wrong reasons. So it can be used for your newest colleagues and candidates and your most senior administrators. Of course, all the slides from today's presentation are available. And one more free thing, and that's for those of you working on your doctoral degrees. We started a group called finishthedissertation.org. It is free and non-commercial support for doctoral students. We started this literally in a church basement in Boston 6 years ago. We now have students all over the world. And we started it because 69% of doctoral candidates never finish. And we want to help them cross the finish line. So if that's you or a colleague or somebody in your family, somebody you love, help them cross the finish line for free at finishthedissertation.org. If you're university faculty, and by the way, thanks for listening, then I think this might help some of your students who get stuck as well. So let's start with some new evidence. Many of you have heard me before, and so I always feel a burden to share with you the things that I've seen in my travels recently. I was in a high school where failures were down 60%. And what was interesting to me is that when they started their intervention program, which was starting at 1 day, then 2 days, now 5 days a week, when they started that, they feared that all the time of the teachers would be consumed with just doing intervention. And darn it, the kids should have gotten it home, done at home. Well, darn it, the kids should have had intact 2-parent families who checked their homework in backpacks and fed them a nutritious breakfast and limited their access to technology after midnight and so on, but they didn't. So they started this intervention program called Success Period, right adjacent to lunch. And the first couple of weeks, let's be honest, were chaos. But after that, look at what the data says in your slide. Interventions were down 67%. Failures were way down, and the students got the message that if you don't get the work done at home, you're going to get it done during Success Period. Would you rather be with your friends? Great, then get the work done. In other words, the consequence for missing work was no longer F's and zeros. The consequence was getting work done. Was it perfect? No. Failures weren't down 100%, but I'd settle for failures being down 60%. I was in a middle school where the absences were down 70%, suspensions down 60%. Notice well this kind of trifecta of failures, absences, and suspensions all going together. Every time, as a rule of the universe, if you can reduce failures, you'll get behavior better. I think oftentimes we get this backwards, where people will say, well, Doug, we'll work on the academic stuff, but first of all, I've got to get these inmates under control. And I just want to respectfully suggest that is backwards. If you want to have better behavior, create a sense of hope and optimism and stop the pervasive sense of failure that permeates so many schools. When failures were down, and we're going to talk about how to do that in the next few weeks, then suspensions are down and behavior gets better. In elementary school, where frankly a lot of people thought showing up wasn't very important, absences down 80%, proficiency up. And here's the deal. This is not about programs. It's not about things to buy. It's about what you and I do as professionals. It's practices, not programs. So there was no change in students, no change in teachers. They didn't bus out the bad ones and bus in the good ones. It was the same people. What they did was to make different leadership and teaching decisions. And that's what tonight's discussion is all about. So what's the magic formula? Friends, there is no magic formula. It's what we do. It's not what we buy. So stop listening to people who are trying to sell you stuff and start focusing on the decisions that you and I make on a day-to-day basis. Here are the common elements. Number one, they are immediate. Man, this is the same day or same week intervention. Don't wait for the progress report. For goodness sake, don't wait for the end of semester or end of year to say, oh, I guess you failed. Now let's intervene. Now let's go to summer school. These are people who are intervening every single day and every single week. In fact, the best practice that I saw when it came to attendance was same minute. You think I'm exaggerating? I'm not. They called it the 60-second report. 60 seconds, the same minute after the bell rang, people were rushing down the hallway to give the principal the names of anybody who was not in a seat. I don't care if they're tardy, I don't care if they're absent. Anybody not in front of a student is standing up in the principal's office, hand on a cell phone, calling people. And by the way, it does need to be a cell phone, because if the caller ID says Washington High School, people might not answer it. But they're all calling everybody who's not there. Within 20 minutes, even in a large comprehensive school, every single person was contacted. Now, sometimes the kids were in bed, sometimes the parents were in bed. I don't know. All we had to do was to have a sense of urgency. Stop the 2 p.m. robocalls. Stop the 3 p.m. administrative assistant calls. Make it in the first 60 seconds of the school day. That's what leads to a dramatic improvement in attendance and a reduction in tardies. So let's proceed to some things that I've seen with my own eyes. These are not Doug ideas, these are teacher ideas. These are people that I've seen. And before I introduce this, let me just say a bit of humble pie on behalf of every staff developer everywhere. And that is, we think that we're running something. Let me tell you what, I've been in places where they had all the usual suspects. They had, let's see, they had, my friends, Bob Marzano, Rick Wormley, Tom Gusky, myself, and others. And you want to know what? People said, as they did about Demosthenes, how well he spoke. But nobody said, let us march. And when they had teachers presenting, then and only then did they start making changes. So here is the best practice, and it's not about me, it's about these wonderful teachers who I have observed firsthand say, let me show you what works. In the format that they use is a simple, what I would call a science fair format. The left-hand panel, you know what a science fair looks like with the kids. Left-hand panel is the challenge. Middle-hand panel is the intervention. Right-hand panel is the results. And you got to be tough about the format here, because it's not about glitter, it's not about PowerPoint, it's not about dissertations. It's just a simple science fair display. What was my challenge? What was my intervention? What were my results? When I ask people around the country, indeed around the world, why don't you trust educational researchers? You know, we're nice people. They always say, well, Doug, I know you're a nice guy, but it doesn't apply to us. It's not local. So I don't care if you have 2,000 schools and 1 million students. It doesn't apply to us. Well, if you'll take advantage of this science fair idea, it does apply to you, because it provides local evidence of your students, your teachers, your communities. Let me illustrate with some examples. These are really great. Here's a high school, about 1,100, 1,200 kids. Used to be kind of suburban, but as has happened in many of your cases, what used to be suburban 10 years ago is becoming more and more urbanized. 385 course failures. So that's the left hand, their challenge. The intervention, they started catch-up Fridays. I just had somebody call me a couple of days ago and say, we've got a modified on that. We call it the Ketchup Cafe, and they made it adjacent to their cafeteria. So this is just one person's idea. You can take it or leave it or modify it as you choose. And the whole idea was, between Monday and Thursday, missing work is between the student and the teacher. But if you're not caught up by Friday, you go to Catch-Up Fridays. And what were the results? Take a look, my friends, at this right-hand panel. At that right-hand panel. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty darn good. From 385 failures down to 15. And they also had more electives because they had fewer repeaters. They had improved attendance. They had a 55% reduction in suspensions. Now, I know all the objections that people will give to these wonderful teachers who tried this. They'll say, well, gosh, if you send them to Catch-Up Fridays, they're missing Friday morning instruction. Friends, take a look at those 385 failures. They might have been sitting down in the classroom. They were missing Friday morning anyway, even if they were sitting there. So by intervening immediately, every week, they got stuff done. And the other objection is, well, I know a kid that won't work for. Me too. I've had belligerent and indifferent kids. So they still had 15 failures. But would you settle for moving from 385 to 15? For goodness sake, I would, especially if I could cut my suspension rate in half. And hey, high school friends, let me just ask you, how would you like to never, ever have another argument on Friday noon about athletic eligibility because the big game is coming up? Everybody has their work done Friday morning. It's the way to go. And yeah, I know it would have been better if they got the work done at home, just like it would have been better if they had nutritious breakfast, and would have been better if they didn't have 3 families living in a 2-bedroom apartment. That would have been better too. But all I know is what I can control is what happens during the day, and that's what these heroic teachers did. Let's look at the next one. I love this. This was middle school math. One of the things that is bedeviling math performance around the country is the constructed response items. And the problem is kids can solve an equation, and even your very best kids will jump ahead and solve an equation, but they don't show their work. And so imagine my middle school math student, Matthew, who I'll say, Matthew, please, explain your answer. And he'll say very slowly, the answer is 7. And I said, no, Matthew, you have to explain your answer. And he'll say, the answer is 7. No, Matthew, that's not what I mean. You have to model complete problem solving. Show me all the steps. So let me tell you what I've seen literally last week with some teachers who were just brilliant in how they approach this. They used to have a very high value constructed response item where students had to go through several different steps. But instead of making it one item, they broke it down, as special education teachers have been doing for about 40 years, into 4 separate problems. So students had to show each element of problem solving. Now, ultimately by the spring, they'll have to do this on their own. But for right now, we had to model complete problem solving. And here's what these teachers did when they showed their results on their science fair board. You could follow the same kid, Matthew, who used to say the answer is 7, to more and more elaborated problem solving. Here's another example for math. The failure rate was 62%. Course repetition, student disengagement, they stopped coming to school. So what did this teacher do? All he did was to change the grading system. He stopped using the average and he started using latest and best evidence. So instead of having kids quit coming to school in March and April, they have the opportunity for resilience, which is one of those skills we want to teach them anyway. He stopped grading homework, and everyone gasped that now the lunatics are running the asylum. And in fact, what kids stopped doing was homework that didn't matter. And let me tell you, friends, there's a lot of homework that doesn't matter. And if you don't believe me, look at your advanced placement students who scored 4s and 5s on their AP tests and got a D in the class for missing work. That is evidence that whatever work they missed was not related to the work that was necessary to score well on a college level examination in advanced placement. And what this heroic teacher did was to focus the classroom work on practice, less of him talking, more of the students actually practicing. The sort of stuff that used to be homework, he now does during class as practice in the same manner that a great music teacher doesn't just have kids practice at home, but practices right then and provides immediate support and feedback. A great coach doesn't send kids home with a basketball in the backpack saying, do the odd numbered problems 1 through 30, but the coach during practice offers feedback, reinforcement, and support. What are the results? Hey, it wasn't perfect. He used to have 62% D's and F's. Now he's got 18%. So it wasn't perfect, but please don't let perfection be your standard. I think going from 62% D's and F's to 18% D's and F's is pretty darn good. Here was a remarkably honest social studies teacher. She told me that she had a huge class load, like 180 students. 120 of them were failing due to missing work. So she started every single week calls to home, reminders, used text, used calls, used everything she could. And she said it wasn't easy. Sometimes people said, thanks, Miss J, for the reminder. Other times they cussed her out. Other times they hung up on her. But all I can say is, look at the results on the right-hand side, from 120 failures to 38. And she was still really disappointed that she had 38, but I think this teacher is a hero for that dramatic reduction in failures. So all I can say is those are real-world examples literally happening right now this year with real teachers. That's not me talking, that's the voices of teachers. And if you want to create real opportunities for improvement in your school, it's not about sit and get professional development. It's not about the inspirational speaker from the outside. It is about teachers doing inside out change. Now, part of the problem is when I suggest things like this, people say, well, Doug, that's great, but we don't have the time. It's always about time. So let's talk for a moment about where we can focus. A few things that I think the evidence suggests we can get better. And then as soon as I finish this, I'm going to give you a moment to formulate questions that we can stop and take right in the middle. I'm not going to wait until the end. Here is Archimedes, our friend who said, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it and I can move the world. And lest you think that he was speaking metaphorically, you can Google Archimedes and moving the world, and some very enterprising AP physics students have actually figured out just how many billion meters that stick needs to be to move the mass of the Earth. So it can be done. But what I want you to notice is in the diagram where the fulcrum is. It's not close to Archimedes. It's close to what he wants to move. And so to my superintendents who are listening, to my principals who are listening, please look at the model. If you want to change the classroom, you got to be really close to what you're trying to move. And that's the only way that you move the earth of education, is to have the fulcrum close to what you're trying to move, not far, far removed. Now, let's get specific. Please do not ask what works, because as my friend John Hattie says, anything with a pulse works. The statistical significance is a really low bar. What I want to suggest is what has not just statistical significance, but what physicians call clinical significance. That is the sort of thing that is so powerful, it's worthwhile stopping some other treatment in order to start this treatment. Here are three things that I think meet that standard, and that is nonfiction writing. In my original research with high poverty schools, one of the things that I noticed when all the other variables were constant is that the high poverty, high success schools had a substantial amount of writing to describe, to persuade, to analyze, to compare. Whereas the same demographic schools with low achievement were largely doing fantasy and fiction and narratives and haikus. And hey, I've got nothing against haikus, but you got to have kids who are willing to write nonfiction. And please do not tell me that this is boring, because I spent years as the advisor to an elementary school newspaper club, and first and second graders will write reviews, they will engage in debates, they'll review video games, they'll review movies and books, they will write to describe, to compare, to persuade, and they love it. Professional learning communities, with the footnote that it's got to be real PLCs. The last article that Rick Dufour wrote before he passed away, he co-wrote with me, called The Futility of PLC Light. And what Rick and I saw around the country, indeed around the world, were people who called themselves professional learning communities, but it was really PLC light. Real professional learning communities engage in consistent practices such as collective ownership of the success of all students, common formative assessments, not just individually made, but everybody, same grade level, same subject, same class, shares a common formative assessment. They ask the four questions. What do we want students to learn? How do we know if they've learned it? What do we do if they don't? What do we do if they already have? Administrators, if you're listening, here's the shorthand. It's learning, assessment, intervention, enrichment. And every time there's a PLC meeting, you ought to be asking, so tell me please about learning, assessment, intervention, enrichment. And if you can't tell me about those four things, then darn it, it's not a professional learning community meeting. And finally, effective feedback. And effective feedback is not just grading, but it's all the ways that we give feedback. We'll talk more about that later. So I'm going to pause for about 2 minutes, give you an opportunity for questions before we proceed to our next subject for what matters right now. About 1 more minute, please. About 30 seconds, please. Okay, so before we move on, let me address some of the very thoughtful and interesting questions that you raised. First of all, as always, I was speaking too rapidly, and you asked what the fourth element of professional learning community questions are. They were intervention, assessment, I'm sorry, they were learning, assessment, intervention, and enrichment. So the fourth was enrichment that several of you asked about. So the questions, remember, are what do we want students to learn? How do we know if they've learned it? That's assessment. What do we do if they don't? That's enrichment. That's intervention. And what we do if they already have? That's enrichment. So learning, assessment, intervention, enrichment. Those are the four elements that we ought to have in every PLC meeting. So several of you also asked, what do I do if my staff doesn't agree? I will tell you, I'm working on a new book right now called The New Model of Educational Change. And I take quite a contrary view to my friends who have written thoughtfully and extensively about change. But to be fair, they're thoughtful, but I think they're wrong when they say, first you got to get buy-in and then you can have change. I think that's exactly backwards. The evidence overwhelmingly when it comes to psychological and behavioral change says the following. Behavior precedes belief. You don't wait to have buy-in from everybody. And let's take nonfiction writing as the example. You don't wait to have buy-in and then we do nonfiction writing, because nobody outside of English language arts is going to buy into the fact that nonfiction writing is helpful, even though I've got 1 million kids of data that says more nonfiction writing helps mathematics, helps science, helps social studies, helps reading comprehension. You'll still have people resist you. So I've stopped asking for buy-in, and I'll just say, look, I want to acknowledge and respect the fact that we disagree about this. So I'm not asking you to buy in. What I'm asking for is a fair shot. And if you're willing to do nonfiction writing in your social studies class once a month, you choose the day, you choose the prompt, make it related to you. We'll have an abbreviated rubric, so you're not trying to do 6th grade writing in a social studies class, just maybe a third of a page, but we all agree in every subject we'll do nonfiction writing. And if we don't have better results by the end of the year, I'll admit in front of you and all my colleagues that I was wrong. But if we do have better results, as I think the evidence suggests, then I'm going to ask you to continue. Isn't that a more respectful dialogue than trying to beat people into submission? So I'm not asking for buy-in. I know you've got a veteran staff. I know you have a staff that disagrees. I respect that. In fact, what I would say is differentiate between the skeptics and the cynics. The skeptics on your staff, the veterans, they've got a right to be skeptical, because in a 30-year career, they've seen 30 hot deals come and go. And I totally understand their skepticism, and I respect their experience, their status, and their skepticism. What they want to see is evidence. And God bless the skeptics, because the skeptics brought us the scientific revolution. Skeptics brought us the technology revolution. Nobody believed it, nobody bought in, and then they saw the results, and then they bought in. That's what I'm asking for here. Behavior first, then belief. You asked, speak to reciprocal accountability. And that is, I think, a really insightful point, if I understand your point correctly, that it's not just about students being accountable to us. We have to be accountable to the students. And I would argue the next generation accountability programs are not all about test scores. The next generation accountability programs are reciprocal, as your thoughtful question suggests, that include both causes and effects, both what students are earning in terms of achievement, but also what teachers and leaders are doing. We've got to be accountable as well. You said my staff has read The Case Against Zero, probably my most quoted article in history, and it says, but they have ABCD report cards. Hey, guess what? As I'm going to say in a minute, I'm okay with ABCDF report cards as long as they're accurate. And the problem with the zero is not the zero itself, it's the zero on the 100-point scale. And as I'll point out, bear with me for just a few more minutes, that's the inaccuracy of it. So I'm not here to argue against ABCDF grading. If that's what the culture of your school is, stop fighting City Hall and accept that I think people are fighting the wrong battle. What I'm arguing for is, even if you keep ABCDF grading, make it accurate. And the 0 on a 100-point scale is not accurate. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. You said, how do you, excuse me, I have a hard time seeing, how do you build capacity in administrators when they're not necessarily instructionally grounded? Hey, so we're among friends here, nobody's listening. Let's talk candidly. We've had 20 years of instructional leadership discussions, assuming that everybody who leads a building is an instructional leadership. No, they're not. In fact, a lot of people got promoted to building leadership because they were a good fixer, not necessarily because they're an instructional leader. And you know what? I'm okay with that. I think we need managers. I think we need people who can handle budgets and discipline and bus duty and that sort of thing. And I don't hold it against people if that's their skill. What I'm saying is that somebody on the leadership team has got to be the instructional leader. Maybe it's the principal, maybe it's not. But we have to stop the fiction that as soon as somebody is automatically made a principal, they're automatically imbued with instructional leadership insights, because it's simply not true. We have to be honest with each other. Every building does need an instructional leader. It may or may not be the building principal. So more about that later on, but let's for now return to our program and that I promised you. Let's see if I can, oops, here we go. So let's get back to leverage. That's where we ended up. And the question of always is, what do you stop doing? So if you're going to focus on professional learning communities and good feedback and that sort of thing, what do you stop doing? Well, if we're up to me, we would make a bonfire of worksheets because once students have engaged in initial practice that perfects a skill, they don't need to continue to do it. This is the stuff of what almost all homework is. It is why students learn to hate school at a very early age. So yes, some practice is necessary, but effective practice is differentiated. Effective practice, as soon as I've mastered a skill, moves on. Most worksheets are the academic equivalent of students playing the C major scale all year long and never advancing beyond that. That's what makes kids hate music. It's what makes kids hate math. So stop doing it. A lot of information and sharing in meetings. There's a coffee mug out there that says one more meeting that could have been an email. My friends, making announcements in meetings is primitive. I interviewed a principal who I thought was remarkably effective, and I asked her, how is it that you've been able to accomplish so much with respect to collaborative scoring and common formative assessments? You've got the same bargaining agreement, you've got the same schedule, you've got the same money that everybody else has. And she shot back at me, I haven't done a traditional staff meeting for 3 years. She just stopped doing staff meetings and spent that time, instead of information and sharing, in getting real work done. There's a ton of instructional units out there unrelated to essential knowledge. I was in a library a few weeks ago where the publishers had displayed yet another round of 500- and 600-page textbooks that nobody is going to use, but the district will no doubt buy. And I just want to respectfully suggest there's tons of instructional units in there that are not related to what's really essential. And the essential standards are a small subset of all the standards that people think they need to cover. Our middle school math teachers, for example, are typically facing 45 and 50 standards to cover. There's about 6 that they need to know. Perhaps we'll address that later on. And for the administrators listening in, let me say on behalf of your teachers, please do not make observations unless you're going to give me face-to-face oral feedback. None of this computer stuff, none of this devices, none of this automated emails. Tell me face-to-face what you saw, what you didn't see, and do it the same day. If you're not going to do that, then please don't even bother making the observation. And if I can tread on some delicate territory here, a lot of you are heavily invested in instructional rounds. And I will say, Dick Elmore is a prince among men and a genius. That said, a lot of instructional rounds are going way off the rails because people don't agree on what they're looking for. And the teacher is left wondering, I'm the lab rat here. Everybody came in and looked at the cage, but nobody told me what they saw. That is a formula for disengagement and disharmony among your teaching staff. Tell us what you see and give us observations the same day. So how do you address initiative fatigue? Well, I think the answer is a process we've called impact insight. And that is, number one, inventory every single instructional and leadership initiative that you've got. They're always longer than you think that they are. And I've interviewed senior leaders who tell me, well, there's only 5 or 6. Every time I interview teachers, they tell me there's 50 or 60. So take the inventory. Number two, we create an implementation rubric. That is a 4-level rubric of what's implemented at what degree. This is frankly something that vendors don't always tell you. They'll say, well, we're doing it or we're not doing it. That is not true. There's a continuum of implementation, and what you need to know as educators and leaders is, what is the degree of implementation? And thirdly, then we assess the degree of implementation building by building and the impact on student achievement. If you really want to get a handle on initiative fatigue, offline later on, ask me about Impact Insight, because I've got colleagues who do a pretty brilliant job of this. Why? Because the law of initiative fatigue will kill you every time. You can get some good gains in student achievement when you go from a few initiatives up to 6. But after 6 or 7, look at what happens. That's the result of 2,000 schools. More initiatives, Michael Fullen said, are inversely proportionate to gains in student achievement. He wrote the foreword to that book that I wrote called Finding Your Leadership Focus, and Michael was right. More initiatives aren't helping us. In fact, they're leading to adverse consequences. Why is the law of initiative fatigue true? Because you can't monitor more than about half a dozen things. When we have 25, 30 initiatives, then all we're doing is monitoring once a year. And we've got to be able to monitor impact and engagement, implementation every single month, if not more frequently. And as a result, frustration and antagonism takes over when implementation is ineffective. So here is an example of what I saw. You ask the senior leaders, what are your initiatives? Here's what they say. You ask the teachers, what are your initiatives? Here's what they say. They're overwhelmed with these things. And we've got to be willing to narrow the focus to not get more than about 6 or 7 initiatives all the time. Why is that important? Here's the data. I looked at more than 2,000 school plans. I found some that had more than 70 priorities, a district with more than 240. And as Michael said, when you get more than about 6, it's a counterproductive waste of time. Here are the fundamental findings from that study. You got to have efficacy. That's the bone deep belief that we matter. And to linger on this for a moment, please do not bring in the inspirational speaker to sing the efficacy song and do the efficacy dance. What we need to do instead is to ask people the following question: what causes student achievement? When we did that in these 2,000 schools, we found some people that said, well, I'm just a potted plant here, nothing I can do. It's all parents, it's all home, it's all out of school environments. That's low efficacy. But when I've been interviewing teachers and leaders in the last several months, and I'll just ask them, and do this with your faculty tomorrow, what causes student achievement? They'll talk about relationships. They'll talk about engagement. They'll talk about effective feedback. They'll talk about effective instruction, all the things that you and I can control. Now, I'm not unmindful of the fact that home factors are important, but when you've got efficacy, that means the things we can control or we can influence are dramatically more important than the things we can't control. And that is very, very consistent, by the way, with Robert Marzano's latest meta-analysis. Collective efficacy was number 1. John Hattie's latest synthesis that says collective efficacy out of 240 variables, number 1. Michael Fullen, Andy Hargraves have identified efficacy from a qualitative perspective. Efficacy is number 1. Now think about it. When you've got a quantitative person like me, a meta-analyst like Marzano, a synthesizer of meta-analyses like Hattie, a qualitative analyst like Michael Fullen, all coming to the same conclusion, then we got to take that to the bank. Efficacy is pretty darn important. Prioritization, 6 or fewer. Specificity and measurability. What I did was to parse out the elements of SMART goals, S-M-A-R-T. You can do all of those if you want, but it turns out that specificity and measurability are most important, and monitoring. But to be clear, everybody monitors kids. What these schools did was to monitor what the adults were doing. For example, frequency of nonfiction writing, frequency of collaborative scoring. There are very specific things that we can monitor on the part of adults that really help us get better. How important is it? Take a look at this graph. The vertical axis here represents the gains or losses in student achievement over the course of 3 years, elementary, middle, and high school, in reading and writing, science, math, and social studies, Friends, that is not just statistically significant, that is clinically significant. Giant differences between those on the left-hand side who are low in efficacy, prioritization, specificity, measurability monitoring, and those on the right-hand side who are high in efficacy, specificity, measurability monitoring, prioritization, and so on. What about the highest performing schools? I know we have high performing schools listening in, and you may think, well, Doug, I've already got this wired. Perhaps you do, but you could triple your gains if you got better at efficacy, monitoring, specificity, measurability, prioritization, and so on. And what about the lowest performing schools? It's a tragedy, friends. Look at those dramatic differences on the left and the right. They've got to get really good at efficacy, prioritization, specificity, measurability, monitoring, just to break even. So, some other key findings. You get more than 6 priorities, throw in the towel. You got to get 90% faculty participation, but not 100%. And I just want to respectfully say to my administrators who are listening, you're spending way too much time getting that last 2% to cave in when you ought to be spending most of your time on that 90%, 95, 98%, who are doing everything you ask and more. And most importantly, it's practices, not programs. What you do, what you create, what you own, not what you buy. Now, I know that there are people who are thinking, Doug, we're buried into this, but there's no malice, and you're right. There is no malice. Everybody's trying to help you. Only 4% of high poverty schools had high levels of focus. Only 2% of high second language schools had high focus. Only 5% of high special ed schools had high levels of focus. There's no malice here. Everybody's trying to help you. Here's a grant. There's a grant. Here's a university to help you. I understand all that. But what they think when they're offering this assistance is that they're the only program out there, when in fact you are being buried under one initiative after another after the other, and it's not helping. So finally, let us turn our attention to feedback. You want to have something that you can do this semester. Literally in the next few weeks, it'll make a difference. Get feedback right. Hattie reminds us that feedback is one of the most important variables that all of us can consider. Out of more than 60,000 studies and 250 million students, this stuff really matters. So what are the criteria for effective feedback? It's got to be fast, that is fair, accurate, specific, and timely. Fairness is all about consistency. If you are going to an athletic contest, and this happens to be broadcast during football season, and you show up to an away game and the football team tells you, that's very interesting that you came to visit us, but we've decided to change the shape of the ball, the shape of the field, and the rules. I don't think your students will play that game very often, because when they know that it's not fair because the rules are changing, then they stop playing the game. That is exactly what happens when a student has 7 different teachers with 7 different feedback and grading processes. It's not fair. It's got to be accurate. Our feedback systems are riddled with inaccuracy. And let me use my discipline of mathematics as an example. When students think that they're being graded on mathematics, when in fact what we're grading is English language literacy with numbers in it. And by the way, this is not just an issue for English language learners. There are plenty of kids who speak English at home and have been here all their lives in this country, and they still lack the vocabulary and the reading comprehension skills to understand a story problem. So math teachers, let's be clear, are we assessing math or are we assessing English language literacy with numbers in it? The only way I know of to distinguish those two is to have some assessments that are numbers and symbols only, and others that are embedded in story problems. And let's be accurate. We've got to be specific. Let us know exactly what we need to do to improve, not just math B or history B minus. Tell me exactly what I need to do to get better. And it's got to be timely. Not at the end of the semester, but timely like a great coach does, timely like a great music teacher does, immediately, so I can have fast feedback, fair, accurate, specific, and timely. Now, there's a big picture that we need to be cognizant of when we talk about improvements in feedback and grading, and that is for 28 years, this country has been a standards-based country. This goes back a long time. It's not just about No Child Left Behind. We made a distinction when the bell curve was written in 1994 as a moral and ethical principle to reject the bell curve and embrace standards, to reject comparing students against one another and embrace comparing them against a objective standard of performance. That is, by the way that we observe and evaluate teenage drivers, jet airplane pilots, brain surgeons. It's all about not who beat whom, but an objective standard of performance. So we got to go back and say the reason we've got standards, however flawed they may be, is that they are better morally and ethically than the bell curve. They're more accurate than the bell curve. The bell curve gave us the worst of all worlds, where we validated bad performance. Well, I'm not very good, but at least I beat that other kid. And invalidated good performance. If I didn't beat the suburbs, then I guess I'm no good. The only accurate way to evaluate students is compared to a standard. So let us get to the final issue of tonight's discussion, and that is grading. As you approach this very difficult, controversial subject, first rule is talk about what does not change. So I know that I'm an outlier here because there's a lot of very thoughtful advocates of standards-based grading that says you need to toss out letter grades. Friends, I disagree. I've seen superintendents lose their job over this. I've seen reform set back a decade because people argued over letter grades. So here's where I am. You want to have A, B, C, D, F grades? Fine. Have A, B, C, D, F grades. Let's just make them accurate. You're afraid you're going to lose academic honors? No, we'll still have academic honors. If it's up to me, there'll be highest honors, high honors, and honors on a standards-based basis. The faculty agrees. For example, highest honors is only 3.9 or higher. If nobody gets it, nobody has highest honors. If 3 people get it, 3 people have highest honors, but it's objective and fair. And this is really worth fighting for, friends, because right now what's happening is that the valedictorian may be a 3.99994, and the salutatorian is 3.99993. And the difference is who didn't take 9th grade band, or more perniciously, the difference is who wound up not having to work in the summertime so I could take an extra college class with quality points. It's all about money. It's not about necessarily academic proficiency. Go to the Ivy League system of highest honors, high honors, and honors. You can still have a high degree of rigor, but it's a much more fair playing field. We'll still have transcripts. Don't let the rumors start that if you do standards-based grading, you lose transcripts for college admissions and scholarships. We'll still have those. That's ridiculous. We'll still have IEPs. I don't know where that rumor got started. Identify what we're going to still have, what does not change. Then you can focus your attention on the following. And let me share with you the fundamental research that I think will blow people away. You ask your colleagues, what's the difference between students who make high marks and low marks? That is, who make A's and B's versus D's and F's. And let people express a dozen or more hypotheses. Well, it's parental support, it's cognitive ability, it's just raw intelligence, it's prior knowledge, it's organization, it's time management. Let them just go on and on and on and articulate all those differences. And they'll be certain, they'll all agree that's the difference between who makes A's and B's and who makes D's and F's. And then what I've done more than 10,000 times is to give people a set of grades and say, now please grade this person. And here's what I found. What you see before you is the same student with the same parents, the same intelligence, the same background knowledge, the same organization, the same time management, the same everything, and they might have had an A or a B or a C or a D or an F. Now, I want you to imagine that you send your triplets to Washington High School. They all had the same 2-teacher family. They all had the same nutritious breakfast. I know you treat them right. They all had backpack inspections. They all had homework reviewed, and they all had 3 different teachers. And one of them had an A, and one of them had a C, and one of them had an F for the exact same work. And you'd ask your children, how'd you get that grade? And they'd say, I don't know. And they'd be telling you the truth, because the same kid with the same work and the same everything could have had an A, B, C, D, or F. And friends, that is the definition of being unfair. And what happens, we said, when kids know that a game is unfair? They stop playing the game. So how are we going to fix this? Here's the final things for this evening's discussion. You can fix this right now. You can change the consequences for poor or missing work. I guarantee you, if you ask right now, what's the cause for D's and F's in any of your classes at any age, it'll be missing work. I know a few of them are behavior, a few of them are attendance, but the vast majority are due to poor and missing work. We got to get rid of the average. The average is a primitive way to evaluate students. In most of your jurisdictions, you make fifth graders, 10 and 11-year-old students learn about mean and median and mode because they know as 10 and 11-year-olds that the average is not the best way to represent a data set. Think of it this way. If LeBron James moves into your neighborhood, the average income is going to go up. Is that a right representation of your income? I don't think so. Moreover, the average, when you have a student who plods, makes mistakes, plods, makes mistakes, plods, make mistakes, and then has a breakthrough, the average focuses on the mistakes instead of the breakthrough. And I hope you've been lucky enough, as all of us have, to have students, maybe you've been one, who had that breakthrough, and you want to be evaluated based upon the breakthrough, not the average of all your mistakes. The 0 on the 100-point scale, and this is the issue that you raised a few moments ago. It's not the 0 that I object to, though the case against the 0 is certainly widely quoted. It's the inaccurate 0. So here's the way that you make this case. If you have a 100-point scale where A is a 90, B is an 80, C is a 70, D is a 60, but not turning work in is a 0, you're making the case that a 0 is that not turning work in is 6 times worse than doing it wretchedly and getting a D, because the interval between 90 and 80 is 10, between 80 and 70 is 10, 70 and 60 is 10, but between a D at 60 and not turning it in is 60, you're saying that it's 6 times worse. And here's the punchline. Let's say that we go back to the old-fashioned ABCDF system. That's the way it's been for most of the almost 400 years of public education in this country, ABCDS. And let's report it like we report regular grades. A is a 4, B is a 3, C is a 2, D is a 1. But if you don't turn work in, you get a, all together now, if you don't turn work in, you get a 0. That's right. So A is a 4, B is a 3, C is a 2, D is a 1. But if you don't turn work in, you get a 0. Ask your most recalcitrant, skeptical faculty that question. A is a 4, B is a 3, C is a 2, D is a 1. But if you don't turn work in, what do you get? They're going to say a 0. None of them are going to say, well, gosh, Doug, if you don't turn work in, you get a -6, because not turning work in is 6 times worse than doing it wretchedly and getting a 1 or a D. Nobody even thinks that way. But they'd have to be intellectually consistent with the 0 on the 100-point scale. So I know some of you use 50 as a minimum, and then you have the newspaper editor giving you a hard time for giving kids 50 points for doing nothing. So forget about the 100-point scale. You don't have to use that. Go back to the old-fashioned 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, A, B, C, D, F. You can rescale PowerSchool or any other electronic grading system, not to 100 points, but to 4 points, and it eliminates the argument. How about incentives for early work? Here's something you can try right now. Give kids an incentive that if they get an A or a B in an early final, then they don't have to take it. I've seen that done, and it dramatically improves pass rates. Menu systems, different ways to demonstrate proficiency. I've written about these extensively. So these are all things that you can do. And the final thing that I'm going to say, and then I'll take some more questions, are things that I've seen around the country. The catch-up solution, that is catching up, as I suggested earlier, every week, not at the end of a semester, not at the end of a year. A red, yellow, green system where every week students are monitored about who's missing assignments, who's in danger of failure, and if you're yellow, that you're missing a couple of assignments, you get your backpack inspected. If you're red, we look at your backpack, your pens, your pencils, your assignment notebooks. And all I can say is dramatically positive results. In the red, yellow, green system, they, in a school of 1,700 students, reduced course repetitions by 180 students. Quiet table at lunch. I thought that was going to be a sanction. Some kids actually volunteered for it. They thought it was a reward. And you might think, well, gee, you can't get much done in 20 or 30 minutes. Yes, you can. Because if you've got a quiet table that's focused on getting work done, that's way more work in 20 minutes than students do at home in 3 hours when they do 30 seconds of homework and then 3 minutes of FaceTime and 30 seconds of homework and then they're updating Pinterest, and the list goes on and on. All the time spent at home is not focused time as it could be at the quiet table at lunch. Coach's Corner has people sitting on the gym floor. The bottom line is our kindergarten teachers know how to do this. They know that there's one column over here for letters and numbers, academic achievement. Another column over here for behavior, standing in line, following directions, respecting your peers. They can separate behavior from academics. That's what we have to do at every other level. So I want to give you a few minutes to ask final questions, and then we'll adjourn. So please use your question function. I'll give you about 60 seconds to pose them, and then I will respond. Here's a really thoughtful question. How do you build capacity? That science fair idea, and I want to be clear, the credit goes to these teachers who did it, not to me. That's the best capacity builder I've ever seen. And I've watched very skeptical high school faculty say, I didn't think that this idea of getting rid of the average or getting rid of the 0 in the 100-point scale was going to work, but I did it. I tried it in a couple of sections. Here's the results. Here's how it worked with our kids in our system, in my classes. Then I became a believer. It wasn't what I said. It was teacher-to-teacher communication. That's how you really build capacity. What about incentive days for students who have not earned a D or F? Hey, I think you've nailed it. We have so much focus on grading as punishment. And Tom Guskey of the University of Kentucky has wisely said, if we've learned anything in a century of research, it is that grading as punishment doesn't work. In fact, put yourself in the mind of the adolescent who is told, you know, if you don't turn work in on time, it's a 0, and I don't take late work. They don't say, oh me, oh my, I shall become a better time manager. They say, oh, that means I don't have to do it. It's a reward, not a punishment. And so instead of thinking about punishments, let's have the consequence for missing work be doing the work, and the consequence for getting the work done being the incentive, as you wisely suggest, of time. Adolescents value time. They value freedom. And that's the right way to incentivize them, not with punishment and sanctions. You say students who have earned these Fs go to study hall, others have fun. I'm cool with that. I think fun is undervalued in school, and we need to have more of that. By the way, if this were a seminar on homework, I'd be saying, let's give homework a rest, my friends, and let kids go out and play and breathe fresh air and have some fun. The evidence for K-5 listeners is that homework from K-5 has 0, zip, not an impact. Let them have fun. Let them play. Anybody wants to write me, I'll send you the evidence on that. I'm an elementary principal, and I'm sorry, I have difficulty reading some of this, who's open to grading conversation. They are open to the idea. So if I understand the question right, are there different ways to allocate points? Well, I've seen some people change the point value from 100 to 0 to like 20, 40, 60, 80. I think honestly that's overcomplicating it. Everybody understands A, B, C, D, F grading. And so to just go back to the old-fashioned A is a 4, B is a 3, C is a 2, D is an F, and D is a 1, F is a 0. Everybody understands that. And if people want these, as your question suggests, fine gradations between different levels of points, you can have 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. I think, honestly, most of that is a distinction without a difference. Just as on the 100-point scale, I don't think anybody can tell me that an 82 is significantly different from an 83. It's needles, it's angels dancing on the end of a pin. So I always argue in favor of simplicity, stuff that people understand. Don't overcomplicate it. If your faculty wants to do it your way or try it, that's fine. But please do consider the most simple way, ABCDF 43210. Let's see. The opposition I get consistently is that we reward students for doing work that wasn't done. Look, I get that. And here is a really good note for us to conclude our agreement on, our evening on. We are not in opposition to parents and to teachers who want their kids to be prepared for the real world, who want them to learn good work habits. We agree on that. And I'm tough as nails about wanting high expectations for kids. The only question is, what's the best way to do that? If F's and zeros as a consequence for missing work were effective, then after doing it for about 100 years, you should be able to tell me that you've got more on-time work and more quality work than you've ever had in history. But I don't hear anybody saying that. So we all agree we want to have kids who are well-behaved. We want to have kids who are responsible. We want to have kids who turn work in on time. We all agree on that. The question is, what's the right consequence to make that happen? In the case that I'm making is that the right consequence are things like restrictions on time, the catch-up solution, the red, yellow, green solution, coach's corner solution, and all the other things that you've heard about tonight. That's better than F's and zeros, which have not worked demonstrably. So we're not in opposition. We want kids to be more organized and better behaved and more responsible. But F's and zeros have failed to accomplish that objectives, and I think the more constructive alternatives we've discussed tonight do that. I want to thank you so much for listening and encourage you, if you want to continue to be in touch with me. I've put my contact information personally up on the board, and I hope you'll take advantage of that. And if the spirit moves you, I'm more than happy to visit your part of the country, and I hope you'll come visit me in Boston sometime. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great rest of the evening.